Welcome to season 4 of the Founders Only podcast, where we uncover the pivotal trials and triumphs and the stories of great founders delivering actionable advice on how to be the leader of the pack. Today, I am so excited to welcome Marcel Petitpas, the CEO of Parakeeto, which specializes in enhancing agency profitability through streamlined operations. Marcel is also the head strategic coach at SaaS Academy by Dan Martell, which is the top coaching program for B2B SaaS companies worldwide. Marcel's expertise extends to speaking. He also has a podcast. And he does consulting and fractional COO consulting, where he simplifies profitability optimization for agencies worldwide. He advocates for measuring the right metrics and improving operations without reliance on complex financial data. Thank you, Marcel, for joining me today.
Mia Horm, I could not be more excited to finally be on the
So
show. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right into tell me your journey to becoming the founder of Parakeeto. Was there a moment or an experience you could paint that picture for me where you said, I really need to create this in the market?
Yeah, you want to know something? I'm going to be really honest with you. That I had some inclination that this was a real problem, but I didn't really fall in love with the problem until a couple of years into working on Parakeeto. And I think I honestly got into it for a lot of the wrong reasons. But to take a step back, I started my professional career working for Apple as an account manager. I got really lucky to land that job. I was super unqualified for it when I got hired, but I was in sales. The Apple rep that we were working with while I was selling cell phones at a Future Shop, which is basically Canadian Best Buy back in the day. And I got referred when that person got promoted. I got the job. I worked at Apple. That was a great experience for me, but I always had an entrepreneurial itch. And in Apple's employment contract, you can't really have a side hustle. So I felt like, hey, I want to start my own thing. And that first thing was an agency. Actually, I was doing virtual reality services for real estate. And yeah, that was like back before you could do it with your iPhone, and there wasn't really good tech for it. And so I left my job at Apple to do that. I went back to selling cell phones part-time, and I worked on that. Closed that up about 6 months in because the unit economics just weren't good enough to scale it, especially at that time. Like, it was a total buyer's market. Real estate agents were not spending a lot of money on their listings. And then I got interested in software. So try to start a couple of SaaS companies, those didn't work out. But through that experience, I met our mutual friend, Dan Martell, and he became a mentor to me. And a few years later, he gave me a phone call and he said, hey, like, he kind of knew I was looking for my next project. He said, hey, I got a friend. His name's Jared. He runs a software development agency out of Boise, and he has an idea for a product that every agency I've ever talked to needs. And if Renee, my wife, had this when she was running her agency on Boardly, she might still be running it. Like, do you want to talk to him? And so I got on the phone with Jared, and he went on to explain to me that his team was spending a couple of days a week in spreadsheets, crunching numbers to just answer these like simple questions that when you run an agency, you're asking yourself every day. Are we making money on clients and projects? When can we start our next client or project? Do we need to hire people? Do we need to fire people? Are people busy enough? And it's all simple stuff, but as I'm sure you know, Mia, it's not that easy to get the numbers together in an accurate and timely way to get that insight and make good decisions. And I said, yeah, I remember feeling that way when I ran my agency. So I said, let's look into it. But really, what I saw was an opportunity to work with two entrepreneurs that I really admired, because I was young at that time and I had never really had like a slam dunk success business. And so I thought, hey, this is an opportunity to like work with Dan, work with Jared, two guys that I respect. Seems like a great idea. Let me just like dive in and prove myself and try to make this work. And that was really fundamentally the reason I jumped in at the start. And it wasn't until I really got familiar with the problem that I realized we're really onto something here, and it's much bigger than what I ever could have imagined.
So, wow. Okay. So yeah, this is new information. I did not know. I did not know that Dan introduced you to your co-founder.
He did. Dan has a way of doing that. He connects a lot of people.
Wow.
It's one of his
Okay,
superpowers.
So how did you meet Dan?
Great question. How did I meet Dan? I was sitting at, so one of my first mentors, his name was Yves Doucette. He was like one of 5 people that ran a software company in the tiny little city that I lived in, Moncton in New Brunswick, which is on the east coast of Canada. Dan was living there at the time. That's where Dan's from. And I remember I was sitting at Starbucks meeting with Yves, and he was mentoring me, and in walks Dan. And he could kind of tell that I already knew who Dan was, right? He could kind of tell that I was a little bit starstruck. I kept looking over and be like, holy shit, is that Dan Martell? And he was like, hey, do you want me to introduce you to Dan? Because I know him, obviously. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. So Eve, flags him down. Hey, Dan, I want to introduce you to Marcel. He's a young founder that I'm mentoring. And Dan goes, hey, did you buy my course? And a couple of weeks earlier, Dan launched the first coaching he'd ever sold to anyone. It wasn't even called SaaS Academy at the time. It was called Idea to Exit. And I was like one of the first 5
Ah,
people on the planet to buy this. And he was just amazed that anyone from his own city had bought it. And so I was like, yeah, I signed up for Idea to Exit. And in that moment, something clicked. And he was like, oh my God, that's so cool. It's great to meet you. A couple weeks later, we ran into each other at a TED Talks event. And then he just started inviting me to founders dinner, which he hosted. I mean, it had to be 2 or 3 times a week. He would just like get a group of founders around, and he'd always make sure there's a couple of young up and comers at the table to get like mentorship. And he just started pulling me into his world slowly. So I don't really know what it is, but that's how we met, and that's kind of how we built a relationship over time. But it was really him just pulling me into these circles and giving
wow.
me opportunity.
So that is really serendipitous. Your story is
Hmm.
very serendipitous and just kind of like a divine order type situation. I wow. I don't really I'm very surprised by this. But it's very cool. Very cool. So you said you had an entrepreneurial bug. Um who was Marcel before he was an
Hmm.
entrepreneur?
I saw this question before the interview and I was reflecting on it a little bit. And I think um, the way I would describe myself was I was the high performing kid that didn't have good grades in school and that all the teachers were frustrated with. They knew how capable I was, but like sitting in math class, sitting in history class, I was bored, I was disengaged, and it just like the system never really worked for me. And what's interesting is if I reflect on my experience, like in high school and even my first year at university, I ended up dropping out of university. I remember thinking at that time, like not even consciously thinking, but just having this certainty that like I wasn't the problem. Like I was looking around and I'm like, I see the people in my class that are getting good grades that measured by this system are high performers, and I just like know that that's not actually the case. And you fast forward a couple of decades and everybody goes out
Mhm.
into the real world, and that has been I my thesis was correct, but I just always kind of felt a little bit misunderstood. Like this system that we're brought up in, education, post-secondary education, go get a job, like never really resonated with me. And as much as in certain contexts I could thrive in that environment, I didn't feel engaged by it. And so I think that was reflected in the few subjects that I did excel in school. A lot of times it had more to do with the teacher and the way that they created an environment in the classroom that enabled my skill set than the subject matter itself. But I think that's how I would summarize it. Like I always had a knack for talking to people, for presenting, for selling ideas. And I always felt like I needed to
Hmm.
operate outside of the
Okay.
system.
So what about your parents? Were either of your parents entrepreneurs?
It's interesting. They weren't, but I recall this one moment that really left an impression on me. Um, my mom was a teacher. My dad was a teacher. He then went and worked for the Canadian government for several decades. So they both had a very, I would say,
Sure.
safe kind of career path, and they were able to provide a great like middle class life for us growing up, and I'm very grateful for that. And I remember one day I was considering quitting my job at Apple. And it was right after I got an offer to promotion, the promotion that I've been working towards since I got hired the first day. I wanted to move to Montreal, become an account manager. I was given that offer, and then I realized in that moment,
Mm.
I don't actually want this. And I know I'm not going to be happy. And if I thought about like what comes after that, I was like, that's not a job that I want. I don't want to be away from my family. And so I called my dad and I said, Dad, I think I'm going to quit my job and start a business. And I fully expected him to say, don't be an idiot. Like you've got a middle class life on a silver platter handed to you. And he said the opposite. He said, when I was your age, I had all these ideas. I wanted to start a business and I never pulled the trigger. And I regret it to this day. And he said, if you hit rock bottom, you can move back in, sleep on my couch. I'll support you. But like, I'm behind you 100%. And that really was the moment that I had the courage to go off and do this, was hearing that from him. And so I'm very blessed to have always had parents that, despite the challenges that, we had at home and that they had between each other, supported my siblings and I 110% anything that we wanted to do.
Wow. Another wow. I love that. That's beautiful. And I was listening yesterday to another podcast where it was the founder of Twilio was sharing his story, and he was talking about how he had previously created another product with some other co-founders, and I think it was pre-seed. They raised like 11 million between friends and family or something, if I'm not mistaken. It was some extreme amount of money, and he was like 21. And he told, he was in college. He created this other product in college, and he went to his parents and was, like, I should drop out. I've raised him $11 million, and they were like, no, don't be crazy. You need to be a doctor or a lawyer or this and that. And so to hear your the opposite, that's really nice. That's really nice. So what's your superpower?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's, I think, becoming my weakness, ironically, is that I am willing and capable of enduring a lot of pain for a really long time to get what I want. And I think that's why I was able to get a business off the ground that has been as challenging as Parakeeto has been, because we're creating something that has never existed before and we're solving a really complex problem. And there's a lesson in there. My expectations were not appropriately managed going into it. I thought I was going to be like a millionaire a year or two, and Parakeeto was just going to take off. And I wasn't expecting that it would take like 4 years to find product market fit. And it was awful. But we're here. I'm still here. I'm still doing it. I think that's the superpower, is I can eat a lot of sand for a really long time, but what got you here won't get you there. And I'm feeling that actually holding me back, where instead of making decisions that allow me to like free myself up, endure less pain, find more balance in my life, and show up as a leader for my team in a way that is more thoughtful and more present and more grounded, I still find myself running face first into painful things that I probably don't need to be doing anymore. And so that's been an interesting journey that I'm currently going on with my therapist and my coach and so on.
Let's pretend you're talking to a younger Marcel, since you said that you had this superpower that could also be, a thorn in your side in some ways. So knowing that it is could be used as a strength, but potentially a weakness, what would you tell the younger Marcel about this looking back? How would you tell the younger Marcel to navigate this, knowing what you know now with your superpower and the fact that it could potentially be a weakness?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's tough to say that I would go back and change anything, or that like objectively, I think I think it is at least required to be willing to endure a lot to become an entrepreneur, because you're opening yourself up to that risk when you choose to go down this path. Like, you're opening yourself up to the risk that some client fire happens at midnight and like you're the one who has to deal with it, or there's a cash flow issue, or somebody quits and steals company information, or you get sued. Like, these kinds of things are on the table when you decide, I'm going to put up my shingle and start my own business. And so I think the willingness to go through that, and then the ability to get through those things, is a necessity. I think that the shift for me, and this is like, I think an answer to a question that comes later, is, what advice would I have had for myself back then? I think the biggest thing that I wish I would have done differently is, instead of spending so much time and energy trying to prove myself right about all of my assumptions, out of insecurity and out of fear of this not working out, I would have spent way more time trying to prove myself wrong as quickly as possible. And I would have I wouldn't have wasted so much of that grit on things that weren't the right thing to be doing in the first place, because I would have been focused on the things that were actually, not going to work, that were invalidated, and I would have found the path
Hmm.
to success a
So
lot
you would
quicker.
have told the younger Marcel to be more intentional and thoughtful about why you're doing what you're doing, why you're spending your time and energy on this particular thing, and instead go into making decisions about how you're going to spend your time and energy using or focusing on uncovering the problems first to figure out whether or not this is a good use of your time and energy. Is that what I'm?
Yeah. And I think the last thing that you mentioned there was being focused on problems instead of like maniacally trying to find solutions. And it's a subtle thing, but I know that you've experienced this. It has been my Achilles heel for like the most of the early part of my career. It's a subtle distinction, but it's so important. And you see it now, and I see it now when I talk to other young entrepreneurs, or even I work with people on my team, where it's like everybody wants to be the one that gets the right answer or that proposes the coolest solution. But it's like we haven't even stopped to really understand the problem. And that is where so much time, money, and energy has been wasted for me, is not stopping to say, what are we wrong about? What's the real problem here? What are we solving for? What are the riskiest assumptions that we currently have about our business? And let's go put as much pressure on those assumptions as early as possible. But the reason I wasn't doing that subconsciously was because I was afraid that if those assumptions turned out to be wrong, that this business, I would have to fold it up. I didn't get the opportunity to work with Dan and Jared. I was going to be a failure. I wasn't going to get my feather in my cap at this point in my career, which I felt like I really needed to feel fulfilled and validated, etc. Right. So we could unpack that for a million years, but
Yeah,
this isn't a therapy session, but you get the
fear of
idea.
failure.
The subtle shift of, I was operating from a place of fear instead of a place of curiosity. And it led to the wrong
Mm,
execution, but it was
mm.
so
I
subtle.
like that. Marcel, one of your superpowers that I've uncovered actually is you have a lot of tactical knowledge about a lot of things around
Mm.
business, from operations to marketing, HR, I guess, which would be kind of part of admin or ops. I'm not sure, but you have a lot of tactical knowledge. Where did you learn that from? How do you learn?
That's a great question. This is so okay. So I have two answers to this. I think one is it's all luck. The first thing that I'm lucky about, right, is that I've just always indexed very high on reading comprehension. So like when I was in the system, that's the thing that I always excelled at. Like head and shoulders above my peers in class. I could read something, I
Hmm.
understood it, and I actually understood it. And that just has always come very naturally to me. And so I think this is what you see, in the context of SaaS Academy, where I can take something really complicated, like a marketing funnel, and it comes very naturally to me that like once I understand something, I can articulate it back really clearly and really simply. So I do have a way of processing things and learning things fairly quickly. And that paired with the fact that I've just been incredibly lucky to find myself surrounded by very, very competent entrepreneurs and leaders. And I have an incredible co founder, and I've gotten access to SaaS Academy and the resources there and the people there. Those two things combined, I think, has just led to me absorbing a lot of really important information and knowledge. Like, for example, my dad, he spent 20 years in conflict mediation, going into like veterans
Hmm.
affairs, like army people, and doing group interventions with 20 people that were all ready to sue each other. And he flies in for 3 weeks and fixes it. Like, so that's, I think, where a lot of my leadership and people skills come from, is like, I grew up with that. I was close to it. That's just pure luck from my perspective. Getting close to someone like Dan, having a co-founder like Ben, who, joined a company at 15 and they scaled to
Hmm.
170 employees in the 5 years that he was there. And he was on the
At
executive team
15?
for that whole ride. Like, he's seen
You said at 15?
exactly what it looks like. Yeah, he started at 15. They had 170 people when he left. They're now 700, like 4 years later. Right. So he got to ride that rocket ship. I have all that knowledge, in the cockpit with me riding this ship. So it's those two things, I think, but mostly it's just being close to people that have this information and not being afraid to go to them and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Can I get your input? Like, what would you do in this situation? And I mean, from being a part of SaaS Academy, that is such a hugely important part of being a founder, is
Mm-hmm.
surrounding yourself with that kind of an
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. So, as the head strategic coach at SaaS Academy, you are in a really unique position to watch a bunch of SaaS founders evolve and grow. Um, what what is one piece of advice you find yourself giving often to those newer businesses that are pre 1 million ARR? What is that one thing you're like, gosh, go look at this thing in campus. Like, what is that one thing that it just keeps being a bottleneck for them?
Yeah. Man, it's such a good question. And just for reference, like over 1,000 coaching calls is what this answer is based on over 6 years. A lot of those one-on-one, but also a lot of them in a group format. So there are a lot of repetitions behind this answer. I could tell you that 80% of the advice that I give is basically the same thing, which is do less, focus on less. You're doing too much. That is what most founders are doing wrong. It's not that they're not working hard enough. It's not that they don't have a good product. It's not that they're not competent. It's not that they don't have good ideas. It's that they're spreading themselves too thin across too many things. And it leads to a couple of problems. Those things aren't getting done well. Most importantly, they're not getting done consistently. And worst of all, they often don't know what's working and what's not because they're so diluted across so many activities. And so that is the majority of what our entire coaching staff does at SaaS Academy, is just trying to get people focused on the few things that are most important and most impactful, and giving themselves permission to say no to other things. Because I think that that's really the challenge, is when you're a CEO and you're laying in bed at night and you're worried about growth and keeping your team fed and accomplishing these goals, and you start to stress
Mhm.
about, like, am I a bad CEO? Am I a bad founder because I'm not doing everything I possibly could to grow this business? And the irony is that that's actually the thing that will hold you
Or it will
back from
create
growing most
burnout,
of the time.
and then you will do less.
Hmm.
Yes,
Correct.
yes,
Yeah.
because you'll
By
be like,
force.
That's it, I'm done."
So, like, with that, the thing we see so often is we have a founder come in and we're looking at their numbers
Mhm,
and we see, hey, you were growing. You got to
mhm,
30K MRR and then you stopped growing. So, like, what were you doing from 0 to 30K MRR? And they'll usually have an answer. Oh, we were in Facebook groups, like hitting people up. We were doing cold email. We were running ads. We were showing up to events, like whatever it is. And then when we look at, like, okay, well, what changed here? Oh, usually
mhm,
the answer is, well, we started X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, cool. Are you still
mhm.
doing the thing that you were doing while you were growing? And the answer is no. So it's like, it's often really that simple, but I understand how they get there because I'm in their shoes too. I need somebody to slap me across the face every quarter as well and tell me to get back on track.
A little sidebar question. How how often do you read, and how do you choose whatever you're consuming, whether it be a podcast or a book or what have you? How do you, do you
Yeah.
is there, do a bunch of people recommend the same book, and so you're like, "Oh, let me go ahead and read that," or how do you make those decisions?
Yeah. I would say that my reading is somewhat seasonal. Like, it comes in waves. I
Mm,
definitely read way more when I'm traveling. So, like, I'm about to 3 out of the next 4 weeks I'm going to be traveling. So I've got a bunch of books downloaded. Like, I'm ready to rock and roll for that. I'm an audio book kind of person. Never been much of
yeah.
like a
Mm,
page book reader. So I tend to consume audiobooks when I'm traveling, when I'm driving, or when I'm like doing stuff around the house. And the way I choose is not that formulaic, but most of the time it's like, what's the
mm,
thing that I'm focused on right now, that I'm trying to learn about right now? What's the challenge that I'm facing in my business right now? So, like, for example, I just brought on two first SDRs at Parakeeto, first two sales hires that we've ever made. So I'm consuming a lot of sales books right now because it's relevant. And I'm sure you've noticed this, like, you might read the same book 3 times over the course of your entrepreneurial career, and you pull different things from them based on what you're going through at that time. So I usually will try to match what I'm reading to the challenges that I'm experiencing in my business. Last quarter was a lot of leadership stuff. I was really having to grow as a leader. I was being challenged in that area. And so that's
Got
where
it.
my reading was
Got it.
focused.
So hitting that first 10K milestone for SaaS founders, that is, usually, I think, it's a big goal.
Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Um, that specific MRR number. How do you
Yeah.
suggest in that
Yeah.
pre 10K that they pick a channel and build brand awareness and adoption for their product?
It's interesting because there are so many ways to get to 10K. Um, and it doesn't mean what I think a lot of people think it means. So you can get to 10K MRR without product market fit. We did it at Parakeeto. That was a trap because we were at 10K MRR. And so we thought we had product market fit, but then we were stuck there for 3 years because we didn't. And so that is it is such an interesting question, because the first thing is you got to have product market fit. And so whether you're pre 10K or you're at 10K, that's got to be the primary focus. And the mentality around customer acquisition at that point in time is it's almost irrelevant
Mhm.
how much money you're making. You're really, customer interaction is the fuel for finding product market fit. It's a necessary ingredient, because if you don't have a feedback loop and you don't have contact with the market, then you're operating in a vacuum and you're building your product based on assumptions. And so based on that, probably the way you get to 10K MRR is going to be very different than the way you go from 10 to 50 or 50 to 100. Because to go from 0 to 10K, depending on your price point, that might only mean a small number of clients, 5, 10 clients, depending on what you're selling. Maybe it's a couple hundred if you're selling something lower ticket, but in that case, you're talking about usually less friction. And in that case, probably do something that doesn't necessarily scale that well, but that you can subsidize with your time as a founder. And so my 2 favorite channels for that, assuming you have limited resources, is number 1, cold outreach. That's how we got our first 10 customers at Parakeeto. I sent 300 emails a day, every day for 3 months, and got on calls with founders and asked for feedback. And then at the end, when they seemed interested, I sold them on our early adopter program, and I got some beta testers that way. And then the next level up from that is, if you feel like you have some expertise and you have an interesting point of view, do cold outreach. But instead of trying to speak directly to your customer, go up a level to people like Mia Horm and go to the platforms that your customer is paying attention to. And you're just making your lever longer. So that was the graduation that I did, as I started with cold outreach to get our first customers. And then I moved up the chain and I started targeting podcasts, coaching groups, mastermind programs, events. And that is the channel that we built Parakeeto on for the first 4 years of our business, is earned media. And today it is still the channel that
Mm-hmm.
drives the most
It
business for
seems,
us.
a little aside here, it seems that very, very recently, and I don't know, I want to say it's timed sometime either just before ChatGPT kind of hit the market, or maybe somewhere around that time, that is really what triggered this different buying journey that I think B2B buyers
Mm,
they are overloaded, and they have just really kind of drawn a line in the sand. It seems like their attention is, they just can't do it anymore, whether it be email, whether it be uh ads or what have you. Like, the fatigue is so quick, and they have such a limited attention span. uh how do you think that is going to impact uh the next 3 years, let's say, maybe even less than that. Let's say 3 years, with the emerging tech and the automation, the ability to automate personalization, which, and the combination of marketing and sales leveraging these tools to mass get their messaging out there, which in turn
yeah.
saturates these channels so quickly, right? How do you think that is going to
Yeah.
impact what you said about these other channels that are influencer based. Do you think that's the direction that we're going in? Is what I have a feeling that the cold outreach is going to go
Yeah.
completely away,
Hmm.
or not away. No, that's the wrong word. It's going to be so
Yeah.
oversaturated so soon by the acceleration that is happening with automation and emerging tech, that everybody is going to have to go to either being a content creator or leveraging the audiences of content creators. Do you agree with that?
Um, I think that the shift you're talking about is very real. I think that there will always be a way to directly reach out to people, but what's always been important is just going to continue to be more important, which is like you can't just like sell to people. I think that direct I got to remember the word for this. I don't even remember the word for this, but it's the idea of essentially like trying to
Mhm,
sell somebody on the first interaction, right? So like direct to conversion, email, ads, even like bottom of funnel SEO, that stuff has been dying. And I think that that is going to continue to trend towards zero. And it's this whole idea of like, oh, marketing is about finding people who want to buy something right now and only targeting them. And it's from advertisement to buy my thing now more than ever, and this is going to continue to happen. Will you still be able to use direct
mhm,
outreach to create awareness? Yeah. And it'll probably be cost effective. Is it likely that anyone is going to buy anything from you in 2035 without Googling you first, seeing if you're actually an expert, reading reviews about your product, comparing you to other options? Probably not. And so I just think that marketers are going to have to stop being so one dimensional in a lot of places. And they're going to have to consider, yes, what channels can we in a cost effective way generate attention through? But you've got to have your funnel too, right? Which is a thing that we've talked about a lot inside of SaaS Academy. You got to have content at the awareness level that helps educate your audience and your market about the problems that they don't know they have. Show that you have expertise. You need to add real value at the middle of the funnel and give them a framework for how to think about the problem. And then you need to position your product in a way that makes it clear who it's for, what outcome it's going to get, and how it's different than the other options on the market. And you have to cover all of those things, I think, in the future if you're going to want to have any kind of sustainable results, especially
mhm,
from a channel like
mhm.
cold
It
outreach.
seems like, I call it the circle of trust from that movie, Meet the Fockers. It's like
Yes.
you have only so many levels of trust in this trust circle, right? You've got the center of the circle, which is like your trust. And that's establishing yourself as a thought leader, or building a relationship one to one. Hey, Mia knows Marcel. You get to know what I do. You have a problem I could potentially solve, and we go there. And then you've got that next ring, which is like, okay, who does Mia know that can validate Mia is legit and is a thought leader, who knows
Mm.
Marcel, and now Marcel trusts this outer ring of the circle of trust, so that now Mia can be brought out into that, or be a part of that conversation or connection. And it just seems like what's happening from just I'm kind of really just talking, uh, hopefully this just makes sense, but it's like the acceleration of automating and mass communication, or communicating in mass to groups, right? People want to go backwards to one to one, and who do I trust? They want to go back to that one to
Yep.
one. Who is the one person that can validate who you are, whether it be you directly or somebody we mutually know? And they don't want to go past that. But I agree with you for
Yep.
sure that cold outreach, whatever form that can be, is good for brand awareness, which is the question that I asked you actually about the conversion. That conversion
Right.
has really is you have to, it's almost like a lab experiment. Like, you have to have all these things that have to be lined up in place for that conversion to happen or something.
Yeah, but to your point, it's actually very simple underneath that, which is you need to create trust. And the way that you create trust is you create real value. And the way that you create value is you actually have like insightful, thoughtful, helpful information, resources, products. And you're even seeing this in the influencer space where it's like the valley girl that doesn't actually like
Mhm.
create any real value in the world. And, and then is like, promoting products that they've never used before that don't work. Like those people are going away. They're not growing their following anymore. They're getting canceled. And the people that are getting attention, growing attention, and are able to monetize that audience are the ones that have integrity, that share real valuable information, that do their diligence on the products that sponsor them. And the same has to be true now about a brand. Gone are the days, I think, that you can just like have ChatGPT word vomit regurgitated information that is like 2,000 words of SEO optimized bullshit. And then when somebody reads it, they're just pissed off that you're wasting their time. And as opposed to taking the time to sit down, craft a unique point of view that is thoughtful on a subject and actually help people in your content. And I think that that is a thing that has never changed, but it's getting more important. And you're going to have that as part of your buyer journey, regardless of what, cost
Mhm.
effective way you might have of creating that
Mhm.
initial attention
Agreed.
in the
Agreed.
audience. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So it's simple but not
it's
easy.
the buyers and the market are, I think, passing the buck back to the business. They're like, you do the work. I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
and we're all jaded from being lied to, from misleading things, from having our time wasted, to your point. And it's also the reason that like cold outreach, you're going to have to get really good at it. It's going to have to get really thoughtful and creative and human. And like because our bullshit meter is just so high. Like you and I both know, we can tell with just by the notification we get on our home screen that an email is spam and we're not going to open it. So like that's what we have to learn how to get past. And then, of course, getting it in the inbox is just going
Mhm.
to keep getting harder.
So
That
let's
just keeps
talk
happening.
metrics, one of your favorite topics, right? So for agencies that are looking
Yeah.
to improve their profitability and monitor their profitability, what are the must track metrics
Yeah.
you recommend for that industry?
Great question. And I think that this is very relevant for SaaS founders too, because mark my words, okay, I'm going to call my shot. Services are coming back in style in software. And the next 10 decades, or the next 10 years, sorry, the next decade, we're going to see the number of software companies that their minimum viable product initially is a service dramatically increase. We're going to see the number of B2B SaaS companies that start charging for things that we currently do for free and call customer success, support, onboarding. We're going to start seeing implementation fees, professional services fees come back. They've always been around, but they're going to come back. So you got to understand as a software company how to think about the profitability of that service component of the business as well. So with that said, there's really one metric that almost no professional services or agency type business is paying attention to, but it's by far the most important one. And it's what we call delivery margin. And if you have a financial background, as I describe this, you're probably going to think to yourself, that sounds a lot like gross margin or contribution margin. And you're right. That's really what it should be called. But I'm sick of arguing with accountants over
Okay.
semantic issues. So I called it something different. So I'm going to call it delivery margin. You call it whatever you want. And what delivery margin measures is essentially when a client pays you money, after you strip out what I call pass-through expenses, so money that doesn't belong to you at all. So, give you an example, Mia. Let's say client pays you $10,000 a month for running their Facebook ads, and you're going to spend $6,000 a month on the Facebook ads on their behalf. You need to subtract that out. So that $10,000 a month retainer is actually a $4,000 a month retainer for you. That $4,000 that's left over, that's what we call your agency gross income. So it's what you now need to earn after we strip out all the things that
Mhm.
pass through you onto other vendors, right? So agency gross income minus delivery cost divided by agency gross income gives you your delivery margin. So let's define delivery cost for a moment. That is what it costs you to deliver on the promise that was made to the client. So let's say, for example, it takes your team, X number of hours at an average cost of $40 per hour to earn that revenue. You subtract that out. What's left over is your delivery margin. On the profit and loss statement, if your business doesn't have, or your service doesn't have, at least a 50% delivery margin, which means you spend less than half of every dollar a client pays you to get the work done, you're going to have trouble running a profitable firm, because you're going to have to spend another 30-ish% of that agency gross income on overhead, sales and marketing, administration, facilities. And you're going to want to have at least 20% left over, or at least you're going to want to set the target there so that when you come in at 80% of target, or you screw a couple things up, or a client doesn't pay you, like, you're still landing somewhere decent, 15% at least. So that's the key idea, is like the delivery margin of the business is the foundation of its profitability. And if we're not measuring that, first of all, what you measure, what you fail to measure, you fail to manage. And we want to keep that at least 50% on the profit and loss statement. And the higher that number goes, the easier it gets to be profitable, and the more optionality you have around your profitability. You now, as a founder, have a choice of, do I invest this back in the business? Do I let it flow through to the bottom line? Now the business is happening for you. Yeah, that's metric number one, delivery margin. Measure it on your P&L. Know what it is before you sell something. Know what it is before you sell something. Anytime you give a price to a client, whether you're selling them an hour of time, or you're selling them a set of deliverables, or you're selling them a retainer, or you're value-based pricing the thing, know how much agency gross income you expect to make from this engagement, and know what your cost of delivery is going to be, and make sure that you're setting yourself up for a delivery margin that gives you a chance at hitting 50% on the P&L. So my recommendation is always price at 70% or higher delivery margin. That gives you some buffer so that you can get to 50% on the P&L and then have a profitable business afterwards. That's going to be jarring to people, but it's really not as crazy as it sounds, actually.
Question about that. You
So,
mentioned the delivery costs
yeah,
would be, the cost, the human cost to deliver. But what about software that you might
yes.
need to deliver the thing? Is that also part of delivery cost? Because you mentioned, the other operational costs as being 30% of the remainder, approximately. So would that be a part of the 30% if I need to use Asana, for example, to manage all my clients? What does that look like?
Yeah. Great question, Mia. We're getting into the weeds now on this. And this is where I think it's important to articulate that the framework that I am proposing, or that we use at Parakeeto, is a management accounting framework. That's an important distinction, because a lot of accountants get pissed off at me because they go, oh, well, all the software should go into one account, because that's how we're going to fill out a tax. That's how we want to organize it for tax purposes. But let me ask you a question, Mia. Does the software that you use in your business, are you using it for different types of things? Do you have software that's for
Right.
sales and marketing? Do you have software that's for administration?
Right.
Do you have software that's just for delivering client projects? Right. So from a management accounting perspective, if I want to know how much I spend on sales and marketing, then I probably need to isolate the software that goes into sales and marketing. I probably also need to offset and isolate the portion of payroll that goes towards people that spend their time in sales and marketing. And for some people, it's going to be only a portion of their salary, because they might be wearing multiple hats, yourself included as the founder. So I want to set that caveat, is this is a management accounting principle, and it's designed to help us understand how are we actually performing as a business. So to answer your question, software. Well, if the software is literally just for that client engagement, it's probably a pass-through expense, right? We probably pull it out just like we would the cost of Facebook ads. However, if it's a tool like, let's say you do a lot of design, you have a Figma subscription, maybe you got an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. That's not just for one client, you're using it for a whole bunch of clients, but your design team needs that tool to do their job. That would be what we call a shared delivery expense. And on the profit and loss statement, it would be considered a delivery cost. Now, the thing is, when you're pricing out an individual project, that's not going to be reflected there. So this is why, if I want to hit a 50% on the profit and loss statement, I want to target 70 at a project level, because there's a bunch of things that are probably going to be a cost in between my project and my P&L level delivery margin. You have these shared delivery expenses. You're probably going to have time off. You're probably going to have gaps in utilization. You're going to have time that your delivery team is paid for, but that isn't spent doing client work. Maybe they're doing professional development. Maybe they're coaching and training each other. Maybe they're, having a foosball tournament every third Friday, because that's like a thing you do as a company. So hopefully that answers your question, but software costs we would consider in the P&L to be a delivery cost, as long as that software is for delivery.
Okay. So what has been your primary marketing channel for Parakeeto? And how did you land on that?
Yeah. So for us, as I kind of mentioned, we started doing cold email to get our first few customers. But then when it came time to say, how are we going to build a repeatable motion here? I chose earned media and borrowed attention essentially as our initial marketing channel. And I wish I could tell you that that was like a very strategic move that was based on some kind of calculated analysis, but it wasn't. It was what we call at SaaS Academy a swag, a scientific wild ass guess. Um, and in hindsight, it turned out to be a really good choice. And I could justify why it was a good choice. Number one, it was very aligned to my skill set. As you can tell, I love to hear myself talk, and so if a marketing channel was, going to reward me for doing that, that was probably a right choice. And then the second piece was that it earned media is really nice because it balances speed and longevity. So you think about like SEO, you can spend a lot of time to write a blog post, get backlinks, build your domain authority to then start ranking for that blog post. And then you get this kind of evergreen flow of content from it, assuming that you maintain it. So it's really slow, but it has this evergreen nature to it. Whereas something like paid ads or cold outreach are very fast, but there isn't very much of an evergreen nature to that. And there's an ongoing cost. They tend to be very capital intensive. Earned media kind of is the best of both worlds, where you can very quickly like get on a podcast, get an initial influx of customers, but then there's a nice long tail and you can start to stack up, in my case, like a couple hundred podcasts over 3 years. And then they're all out there working for you, just like an SEO kind of ranked blog post would. And so in hindsight, it was a great channel for us to kind of start building the business on. It built our domain authority. It built a lot of backlinks organically. It helped us create content in a really efficient way because we could just post produce the interviews that I was doing. And it set the foundation for us to then start stacking SEO on top. But getting on other people's platforms and thinking about who does my customer fund, who do they follow, and what do they frequent, and attacking those sources of attention and adding value and delivering expertise on those platforms, that is really what got us off the ground. And like I said, today is still the channel that
I
brings
like
in the
that.
majority of our
Fund,
business.
follow, and frequent. I like. Yes. Okay,
3 F's.
so what is one, and this is probably the hardest question that I ask, but what is one book, podcast, resource you pick that has impacted your mindset as an entrepreneur the most?
Mm. I was thinking about this one. And if I think about like one of the books that was really, really made an impression on me, it's actually behind me here,
Mm,
right up here. It's called The Go Giver. It's a great book. It's written as a story, which I love. I love the business fables. I'm trying to write a business fable right now. It's really hard, but um, I'm doing it because those are the books I resonated with the most. But The Go Giver really kind of shifted my perspective on exactly this problem that I had when I was just starting out as an entrepreneur, where I was really like doing a lot of things for myself and I wasn't even necessarily conscious of it. And the Go Giver really kind of frames this nice story of this idea of just focusing on creating as much value as possible and going out and solving problems and helping people and being curious. And the idea that that is really how you start to build value and build a business. And it was reinforced by a quote that I don't know where I heard this, but it's like the idea that entrepreneurship is the act of capturing 10% of the value you create in the world. And looking at it through that frame is really kind of a helpful way to reprioritize or reframe the things that you do every day and
leads
where you
me
spend
to
your time and
my
energy.
next question is, how do you spend your day?
Just like this, standing in front of my computer screen. If I'm being completely honest, I wake up at 5:45. I go to the gym. I come home. I have a coffee. I might journal, kind of get ready for my day. I stand in front of my computer for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. I eat, I go to sleep, and that's pretty much what I do Monday through Friday. Um, and it's just indicative of the season that I'm in right now. Like I'm very much in a building season. My fiance just acquired a business in September. She's very much in a building season, and we're on the same page. That it's like this is what we're doing right now. So yeah, that's my honest answer. That's what most of my
Where can
days look
people
like.
find you on social, Marcel?
LinkedIn's probably the best place. It's where I'm most active. So yeah, look for Marcel Petitpas on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, and
And
Instagram
that's
as
your
well. You
first
can
and
follow
last
me on
name?
Instagram. Yeah, Marcel
Okay,
Petitpas on
well,
Instagram.
thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you loved that episode as much as I did.